am Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking about The Hunting Party with co-showrunner JJ Bailey. And one of the first things that I wanted to talk about was, in working with Jake Coburn, who's your co-showrunner on the series, the fact that the two of you kind of both came in with a fascination of serial killers to begin with, and I was really interested in how that kind of shared interest in that idea really turned into this fully fleshed out concept and narrative arc that you've created within the show.
Oh yeah, great question. I will say Jake has been an absolute dream to work with. I didn't know him prior to doing this. We were set up on a blind date from the studio. Basically, we had worked both in our separate ways with the studio before on other projects, and they felt like we would be a good creative team, and so they set us up on this Zoom. So we sat down for a half hour Zoom, and 2 hours later, we were just like, we got to do something together. Like we like all the same stuff, and we both really wanted to do something in the procedural space that felt different. We both really had a fascination with the psychology of serial killers and sort of like how to put that on screen in a dramatic way. And we also really love conspiracy thrillers. And so we were like, let's get all that into one place. And what does that show look like? It's really fun because I will say, he's an incredibly smart guy, and he's able to. Sometimes I'll come to the table with like this half baked idea, or it's like an image or something, and all of a sudden he's like cooked up this whole psychology about it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And so it's been really fun working with him because I think we speak the same language when it comes to this type of stuff. We both have an equal fascination with not just sort of like the psychology of the serial killer, but an equal fascination with the people who choose to hunt those serial killers. Because I think, oftentimes when I talk about the show and people are like, oh, what's Hunting Party about? And I don't always say, it's a show about serial killers. It's a show about the people who are trying to catch the serial killers. And so I'm equally fascinated with both parts of that.
No, that it's so great when it kind of cohesively comes together in that sort of collaboration. And I was also really interested in, obviously, the premise has kind of a serial killer of the week, kind of going into at least these first few episodes of the first season. And I've heard that you would basically have a list of potential killers that you kind of all brainstormed together and come up with. But it's interesting because you'll have some that kind of go into these slightly stranger, weirder places, but it still is grounded in reality and actuality. And so I wanted to ask about how you worked to come up with the idea of this list and, these creative ideas, but made sure that it still felt that way at the end of each episode.
It's a great question. Yeah, so we had just a murderer's row of writers in the writers' room. I mean, it was amazing, and so many great ideas. We did have this. We had a whiteboard that was basically dedicated to our list, and it was just top to bottom of like weird and crazy ideas. Some of them they're just sort of like a shiny object, and if you look at it too long, you realize, oh, this isn't actually a thing, but it sounds cool. Other ones, you're like, that's too scary. We can't do that type of stuff. But it was really fun to see how everybody's mind worked and the type of killers that everybody was coming up with. And ultimately, it came down to sort of two questions. I mean, it was what did we think was sort of the most like frightening version of a killer, like personally to us, like what was most visceral to us as writers, and then how can we sort of turn that on its head a little bit? How can we make that a little bit weirder? Because we want to be, it always sounds so weird to say, but we want to have like fun serial killers on our show. Like we don't want this to necessarily feel like we get compared to Criminal Minds all the time, which I find incredibly flattering. But we don't want to be Criminal Minds. Like Criminal Minds does what they do very, very well. We're not that show. We want to be one that's a little bit more pushed. It's a little more genre, and I think we've done a decent job showing over the course of season one a lot of variety of serial killers. We did have so many. Like I said, our writer's room is fantastic, and the amount of crazy ideas that they came up with was really impressive. And we were able to sort of select ones that felt very different from each other, and really be able to provide a variety.
There's also that point that you just brought up of, coming up with the killers and that one's too scary, so we can't necessarily do that. And what was your approach in making a show where you're not shying away from the fact that it is exploring serial killers and the crimes that they've committed and the impact that that has on people around them, but also kind of keeping it network and making sure it still works within the tone of the show overall?
Yeah, sure. So we had some parameters that we lived within. I mean, one of the things Jake and I always said is just no kids. Like that's not fun. That's too far one direction. He and I both have little kids. Like we didn't want to deal with any serial killers that do anything to kids. So that was like off the table immediately. And then it was really like we wanted more psychologically interesting killers. And yes, we want to be able to show violence and we want to be able to be with our killers when they're doing their killer thing. But we wanted killers that felt more psychologically interesting than just simply like physically intimidating or something, you know. So that was really those are kind of our two parameters: stay away from kids and make sure that we found the killer very psychologically interesting.
And what's interesting about the structure of this is ultimately we know early in the episode who is the killer and what is their type of crime. So we're not trying to figure that out. For you, was it more about what is it that would have made them interesting enough to the people running a place like the Pit that they would want to study them or that they felt like there was a value in them?
That's an incredibly insightful question because that's exactly it. You know, we approached a lot of it from why this killer, why was this guy, this gal brought to the Pit, and because some of them, you know, we talk about being the worst of the worst, and we'll have some cases where you know they killed three people, and okay, is that really the worst serial killer out there? Well, maybe not in terms of numbers, but what was their psychology? What were they? And you know, sort of the more we unpack about the Pit, the more we start to realize like well, they weren't necessarily taking the worst of the worst. They had some freedom to say, like, I find that killer fascinating. Let's explore that person and sort of play fast and loose with ethics, you know, and so sort of using that as a little bit of a guideline for us to choose what killers we pursued as well.
And when you first came up with the concept and the idea of the Pit, you know, because it is something where they feel like they have to feel like there's a value to it. Like there's a reason that we've kept all these people. And we almost feel like if we study them, that either we can change their behaviors over time or that we can learn things to stop other people from being killers, which is a really interesting concept to think about. And I was curious how you landed upon what the justification was going to be for a place like this to exist.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think there's definitely sort of like a party line in terms of justification, and then there's sort of the reality. And I think something we try to tease out over the course of the season is, yeah, sure, a place like this where you study serial killers so that you can understand behavior, so that maybe you can stop somebody from ever becoming some crazy serial killer. That's all good and noble. But when something operates in the shadows for long enough, you know, the red tape goes away, the oversight goes away, and then the experimentation probably takes a change. And so the things that they were after, the things they were trying to understand, you know, some of it was yes, very much about serial killers. Other things they were doing to these serial killers down there were sort of like, oh, was this just an expendable population that they could do experiments on? Because what does that have to do with being a serial killer? And what we're hopeful for is that you know as the show goes on and we sort of reveal more about what this Pit really was and what was going on down there, you'll look back at some of the more benign experiments that were being done, and you'll realize these were part of something larger. Each one of them, as individual as it felt at the time, was actually something connected to something bigger.
And there's obviously a lot of mystery at this point in the story around, you know, who is really running this place. And it kind of already seems very clear that there's different organizations and agencies who are involved in. I love the point that's been made of like the person ultimately responsible is the president, but the problem is the president doesn't even know about it.
Yeah.
Um, and I was interested in how you kind of set about creating what would be the different agencies and groups that would come together because it's not even just that, it's clinical psychologists, it's you know people with military backgrounds being used as guards in a way that you can kind of intentionally gradually reveal more about that and use it to create all these tentacles for future episodes and future seasons.
First of all, I love that you said tentacles because that's exactly how we talk about the show. There's tentacles in every direction, and we talk about you know each season sort of dealing with a different tentacle. That's awesome that you said that. But yeah, we talked a lot about too of you know something like this that shouldn't exist and for all intents and purposes doesn't exist. You know, and then it blows up. Who's going to take responsibility for that? And how do these agencies step on each other? And how do they fight each other? And how do they try to distance themselves? And you know, politically, how are people trying to look for cover? And you know, there's some moments where you see the attorney general and Hassani sort of you know batting heads, and Hassani has information that the attorney general doesn't, and the attorney general has information that Hassani doesn't, and you're sort of like, okay, well, who's really in charge here? And we like that sort of messiness of not really knowing ultimately who is in charge of what, and certain people can push for information because there's not necessarily a clear chain of command. Um, And then, complicating the fact that we're operating out of a military base, obviously that's going to offer resources, but complications as well. And we feel like it gave us this plethora of worlds to pull from, which was really fun and gave us ultimately, if this is a show that can live for 5, 6, 7 years, ultimately we have enough people with vested interest that there's always going to be more story to tell.
And with the fact that there's a lot of mystery at this point and you're kind of doing these gradual reveals of information, how have you wanted to use Melissa Roxburgh's character, who plays Rebecca in the series, as kind of like the eyes and the ears of the audience, because she comes into this completely new, not knowing what's going on. And so we get to learn things firsthand alongside that character.
Yes, absolutely, and that's 100% intentional of wanting to put the audience in her shoes and unfold the story for her in the same way the audience is, and having her ask questions that we feel like the audience would ask too. Presented with this, like, who the hell thought this was a good idea? It's exactly what I'd be asking if I saw this on the news or something. And I think Melissa has done such a wonderful job of both being that strong force, but also vulnerable and letting the audience in. Like, I think one thing that really stood out to us in the casting process was, a lot of people can be that firm, hard investigator, but then they sort of put up a wall. It's challenging to find somebody who can really capture both, and Melissa did that so wonderfully that I think it makes the show work, quite frankly. So that's been a huge pleasure. But yeah.
I also think what you were just describing about Melissa and kind of what she brings to that role also kind of sits in tandem of the pacing of the show, because there's this literal run and gun element to it and moments where you want to have, that bit of tension for the audience and the faster pacing, but then you want to be able to have these breathing moments and those character moments that she can really put forth, or the interpersonal dynamics that you can kind of play around with in the quieter moments. How do you, in the writer's room, kind of set about finding that pacing and that ebb and flow between those two spaces?
Great question. Well, we talk a lot about our show being a shark. Like, it's got to keep moving. So even in those downbeats, we've got to be moving forward. And there's a great quote. I believe it's Sean Ryan who said this, and it's standing is better than sitting, walking is better than standing, and running is better than walking. And I think we sort of look at it that way too, of continuing to move forward. And we want, as creatives behind the show and the actors who portray these characters, we all really want to be able to tell those personal stories, but we have to do it in the context of a manhunt that is urgent and we are running forward, right? So the plane has become a great resource for us, because it's sort of like, naturally we've got to travel from A to B, and there's going to be a natural downbeat as opposed to trying to force something when we're on the run. So the plane has been a great resource for us. And then we do a lot sort of at the end of the episodes too. But part of the nature of being a road show is that you're given a gift of these downbeats, because you do have to travel and you have to go from place to place. And so there's a lot of conversation in the writer's room about where these moments can live, because we want to keep that momentum. We want to keep that urgency. We want to keep the story moving forward at all times. But where can we put this where it doesn't feel like it slows things down, but it feels like either it fits with the moment, so it goes very naturally, or it builds on something, or it can live naturally because this is a natural sort of downbeat in the momentum of our show. So there's a lot of conversation over that, and it's different for every episode. Depending on whether we have to travel across the country or down the street, or what the killer's doing, or what Bex is up against personally. Those moments find themselves in different places, sort of naturally throughout the show as we have those discussions.
And it feels like with the characters as well that you've kind of really played a lot within the gray space. It's not that clean cut of like, these are the good people and these are the bad people. There's kind of like this joy in playing with moral complexity. And even Melissa's character Bex, it's like, she's more inclined out of the group of the three of them to be the rule follower, but she also really understands the world that she works within.
Yeah.
And so how did you set forth to make sure that you were always exploring that kind of like meaty space in the middle?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, I think I think that's where a lot of the interesting dynamics are going to happen. I think we ask ourselves a lot, like, what would we do in this situation? And I think that helps sort of helps us find the right footing in some of those moments. But I also think just the nature of sort of the conspiracy theory part of our show allows for a lot of that. Hassani basically always claiming to be from some other organization every time he shows up to a crime scene, sort of allows him to have this freedom to lie, but you feel like he's still a good guy, you know. And then something we'll see from Bex occasionally is there are certain lines that she can cross because we are sort of operating in the shadows and because we are chasing these really terrible people. It gives her a bit of freedom to cross certain lines that are fun, but up to a point. Like she's not going to do what Odell did, but she can still push things a little bit farther here and there, which is really fun. Because I think, to your point, I think that gray space and that sort of murky morality is sort of baked into the show. I mean, it's a show about a top secret prison where they were experimenting on people. I mean, yeah, they're serial killers, but they're experimenting on people. So we're sort of already just in the world of this gray space. And so putting those characters that have a little bit of ambiguity to them too just felt very natural into the show.
And you were bringing up Odell, and the dynamic between Odell and Bex is really great because she's obviously such an incredible profiler and really reads people, but there's something about him and their history with one another and the time that they spent working together that really kind of throws her off kilter a little bit and off her game. And how have you wanted to use that dynamic to kind of take her off center a little bit throughout the show?
Yeah, that's a great question. We talk a lot about how, he's a little bit of her blind spot, like she is a great profiler. She has all these great insights, but Odell was sort of a mentor figure for her for a while. And yes, in their past, they sort of almost got something romantic really going, and then it was cut short by this terrible thing, and it never got to become what it was. And so I think there's a lot of this sort of like unresolved tension between them that can cloud her judgment a little bit, and very naturally so. I mean, I think it's a very forgivable experience. But I think that plays into how she feels about Odell when Sonny is presenting certain information about him, and Beck's wanting to resist, but can't really deny what she's seeing. And ultimately, where we're going to go with those storylines, bringing them all together in a way where I think Bex can sort of embrace who she knows Odell to be deep down, and not necessarily forgive, but understand. I think that's sort of the important journey she's on.
No, definitely. And kind of even with Bex's skill set and the way that she's able to read people, it kind of creates this space that you can really play within whenever she first meets someone. How is she building trust, or how is she kind of giving someone else like a little piece of her, whether it's true or not, to be able to get them to kind of trust and open up very quickly. Going into a diner and the way that she approaches a waitress and is like, oh yeah, I remember, those sorts of customers when I used to work here, and all of a sudden
Yeah.
they're revealing things. And so how has that skill set made it a little bit different to write interactions for a character like that and the way that she interacts with people who are ultimately strangers?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly right. I think she's savvy enough to know what will work with people, but something that goes so far is just Melissa's innate kindness. Like I think people let her in and she lets you in, and I think that another actress sort of doing those same things may not feel as genuine, but she's really able to capture that. So I think not only did we approach it from a creative standpoint, off the bat with a character who can do that, can identify with somebody and sort of empathize with them very quickly, but Melissa's innate ability to do that has sort of bled into it as well. As the series progresses, we do more of that also because she just has that ability. She's this uncanny ability for you to let your guard down, and so we definitely lean into it.
Lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about just structuring the pilot and kind of structuring the first season of a show, because obviously in the pilot, you're completely building this world from scratch and all of these characters, the audience is meeting them for the first time. So you really have to kind of reel them in. And then as you progress through the first season, you want to give them a fully fleshed out season, but you also want to lay all of these details that you can build off of in the future for future seasons.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to ask a little bit about what went into the structure and that sort of thinking as you were building this first season on the back end.
Yeah, sure. So the pilot was definitely, we have to launch this whole world. We have to lay all this track in terms of backstory, and we have to keep the story moving forward. So it's definitely like a challenging endeavor. And the procedural element of episode one uh, is sort of the smallest chunk of procedure than versus the rest of the episodes, because you only have so much time. You got to set up the world. You've got to get Bex on board. You got to explain what's going on, and you have to chase the bad guy. And so, in terms of the case, it's probably the smallest percentage of the story for episode one. as opposed to, future episodes. Once the show is up and running, people understand the premise, and Bex is on board. She knows what she's doing week to week. And then in terms of like the series, we knew where we wanted season one. We knew what answers we wanted to provide and what new questions we wanted to raise. It was always our goal to get to a very particular place with that. And so working backwards and sort of, we knew we had 10 episodes to do that. You sort of look at them as chapters, and similar as to, breaking a story where you've got, on broadcast TV, we've got 5 acts basically that we're telling the story, or 5 acts in a teaser, and sort of break the season down into the same sort of structure. And, this is where we're going to drop this piece of information so that we can pick that thread up 2 episodes later and reveal the next piece of it. And you sort of look at it. I mean, I like to chart things. And so it was fully like charted out on my wall of like, this is where you're going to learn that. This is where you're going to learn that. And this is how it's going to fit together. And, we don't want too much space between pieces of information so that you remember it and so that it builds on this. And it was very much an orchestrated thing when you step back and look at the season as a whole to get to this place that you want to end the season. So it was, it was a lot of charting and moving things around, and like, is that too soon to reveal that so that it has the biggest impact, or too late? It's a lot of that.
No, it's so great. And thank you so much for sharing all of this, JJ, and congratulations on the show. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to meet you. Thank you.